So the immune system is what we're talking about. It's chapter 47 of your Ricci text. We're also going to be in chapters 45 and 46, I believe, with the infectious diseases, immune responses, and integumentary. So diseases related to the immune system are one of the leading causes of death worldwide. Children, their immune system's still developing, and because of their natural curiosity and their desire to put everything in their mouths, they're a little bit at higher risk. Vaccine use has decreased the amount and the effect of infectious diseases, but we're just having new diseases come out when the old ones start to go away. For instance, human metapneumovirus. I'm sure you guys have heard of it or seen it in the hospital setting. It became much more infectious and virulent once we saw COVID enter the system. So, very interesting. These are our objectives for at least the immune system and infectious diseases. We're going to list the primary functions of the immune system and delineate the differences in the anatomy, physiology, and functioning of the immune system between pediatrics and adult medicine. We're also going to talk a little bit about the immunization schedule and common side effects and adverse reactions of the different vaccines. Okay, so the key concepts here are infection, inflammation, and our vascular and cellular responses. So infection, obviously something invades. There's an organism that crawls into us somehow, multiplies, and damages all of our tissues and cells. And then inflammation is our response to that damage of the tissue and cells. The vascular and cellular response is partly what causes that inflammation. So our body's delivering fluids and blood and nutrients to the infection or injury, and we're trying to kill the pathogens and repair the tissues. So in the vascular response, it starts out with vasoconstriction, and then over time we vasodilate. And that allows for more fluids, more blood, more nutrients to come into the area of injury or disease. And the cells themselves, that's the cellular responses when the white blood cells come galloping in on their horses and decide to take care of all of it. All right, so the definition of an immune response is that it's the body's ability to distinguish and fight off foreign materials. And we have non-specific actions, and then we have very specific actions to fight all kinds of antigens, which are foreign materials that have found their way into our bodies. So some of the non-specific actions, this is our body vasodilating, sending plasma, having a complement response, performing phagocytosis, and then there's some leftovers. So we vasodilate at the small capillaries where we've been invaded. And this increases circulation to the site. Then we move plasma cells into the tissue, and that starts to accumulate. Then the antigen or the invader activates complement. And that's involved in like enzymatic action and antigen death. And it has an inflammatory stimulator that asks neutrophils to come to the space. So then the neutrophils show up first, and they're the phagocytic nonspecific action. So they're digesting the antigen. And if the neutrophils die, they release chemicals that draw more neutrophils, more phagocytes to the area. And then the products left over of the phagocytic antigen death, it can be toxins that sometimes make us have more fever, more pain, and pus. So as we start removing our toxins from, or removing the toxins from the antigen and the phagocytic process, over time, inflammation and all the other symptoms are supposed to subside. So the non-specific response on the previous cell, those we're talking about if the toxin dies and is eaten and digested. The specific responses are if the toxin survives all of the non-specific actions. So at that point, our body has two types of specific responses, and those are humoral mediated or cell mediated responses. Hopefully you guys remember a little bit of this from your anatomy and physiology. So the humoral response is B lymphocytes. So the B lymphocytes, they promote antibody production, and they are making antibodies specific to that antigen. And it's like immunoglobulins. So we get IgG, IgM, IgA, D, and E out of all of the different lymphocytic B cell immunoglobulin creation. Then we have cell-mediated lymphocytes, which are the T cells, and they are reacting specifically to viruses, fungi, parasites, foreign tissues, and then other types of antigens. So I'm going to talk about active and passive immunities. So these are the two ways that we develop immunity. Active immunity is natural and artificial. So we can have a natural active immunity, which is where our body responds to an antigen or an infection. Active immunity is long lasting, it's long lived. We like it. Artificial immunity is like immunizations, vaccines, live, killed, attenuated, recombinant, all of those. We put those viruses or those vaccines into our body, and then our body makes specific antibodies against the antigen that is in that vaccine. Then there's passive immunity, and we do antibody transfer from one person to another, like mother to fetus. This does start to go away by 6 to 9 months of age, which is not great because, you know, that's when they're really starting to put everything in their mouth. And immunoglobulins is also a type of passive immunity, and that's basically immunoglobulins produce some temporary protection after we've been exposed to certain diseases like rabies or chickenpox or yeah, that's all I can think of right now. Okay, so we've got pediatric variations. They are different than us as big people as far as their immunity is concerned because they have an immature response in their immune system. Infants and young children are much more susceptible to infection because of that immature response. they have a decreased inflammatory response. So some people think that that's the reason why neonates will have low-grade temperatures in response to invading organism or something that could cause sepsis, because they have a really decreased inflammatory response. This puts them again at an increased risk for infection. And then there is cellular immunity. It's generally functional at birth, which is nice. Humoral immunity occurs when the body encounters and then develops some immunity to some new diseases, and the infant really doesn't have that. They have very limited exposure to disease, and then over time they're losing the passive immunity that they acquired from the maternal antibodies, and the risk of infection gets higher and higher. We're also going to talk about the differences in the skin and the sweat glands. The epidermis. Let me find what I need to tell you about the epidermis. So it's thinner than that of an adult. The blood vessels are closer to the surface, and there's decreased amounts of subcutaneous fat. So the infant loses heat more readily through their skin than an older child or an adult. This also allows for substances to be absorbed through the skin more readily than it would be in an adult, because the blood vessels are right there so close to the epidermis and there's no subcu fat. Their skin contains more water, and their epidermis is just kind of loosely bound to the dermis, which means there could be friction that causes separation of the layers, which could mean blistering, which then means skin breakdown, and that puts them at a greater risk of infection as well. Their skin's less pigmented, so they have an increased risk of damage of their skin from ultraviolet rays. And then when we talk about the sweat glands, there are eccrine glands and apocrine glands. The eccrine sweat glands in an infant, they function a little bit to produce sweat. They're fully functional by the middle of childhood, so like late school age. And that's when our kids start to stink. So because this is only slightly functional in early infancy and early childhood, their temperature regulation is less effective. The apocrine sweat glands, they are small and completely non-functional at birth. They mature during puberty, which is also when we start really stinking. Yay! So then we're going to talk about their immunization status as well. Their immunization status, their disease protection from immunizations is incomplete, at least until the age of 5. For most children, most vaccine series have not been completed until then, but we have subsequently added on quite a few vaccinations that are happening later in life, like HPV and meningococcal vaccines. So in one of the very first tests or quizzes that I gave you guys, many of you answered that it was a contraindication to receive an immunization if you had a runny nose or cold, or a fever, a low-grade fever. So I wanted to let you know that there really is no permanent contraindication to receiving an immunization other than having had an anaphylactic or systemic allergic reaction to that specific type of vaccine. That does not mean that you shouldn't receive the immunization. You should just receive maybe a different type of that immunization. Severely immunocompromised people or children should not receive any live vaccines. So they can receive killed virus vaccines, recombinant vaccines that are not live, some of the genetically modified vaccines. So some of the live vaccines are the MMR and the varicella. So know that the measles, mumps, rubella, we're going to talk about it, that measles and rubella both have names that sound like they are both measles. So measles, we're going to say is measles in this vaccine, but rubella is the German measles. And that is a less severe, less virulent type of a measles. So MMR and varicella are live vaccines. If the child has a history of what's called a severe combined immunodeficiency or a history of intussusception, they should never receive a rotavirus vaccine. There are some precautions, and those are different from a contraindication. So the precaution is similar to the test question about the child receiving a vaccine when they have a low-grade fever. We don't care about that at all, but a moderate to severe illness with or without a fever, moderate to severe, that's not a child who's being discharged home. That is a precaution to receiving an immunization, meaning that we expect that there is an increased risk of an adverse reaction or a possibility that their ability to create immunity from getting that vaccine is going to be impaired because of their moderate to severe illness. Those conversations are going to take place between the provider and the family to decide whether or not the risk versus benefit is there for that child to go ahead and receive the vaccination regardless. Okay, so these are some of the vaccines. There's a gajillion. You guys have all heard that we give, and some of you may have already done it, hepatitis B at birth. Oh, I've got hepatitis B on here twice. We give DTaP to kids under age 7. The reason there's a big D and a big T is that because the diphtheria and tetanus toxoids are a larger amount here. Then there is what we give or receive as older children or adults, and that is the Tdap. And in a Tdap, the T is still capitalized, but the D is not. And what that means is that the diphtheria toxoid is in smaller amounts because people who are older than age 7 tend to have more significant adverse reactions to full dose diphtheria toxoids. I'm not ever going to test you on that. It's just so you can understand the difference between DTaP and Tdap. For some reason, kids under the age of 7, they don't have as big of a reaction or response to higher levels of diphtheria toxoid. Hib is Haemophilus influenza type B. This is not influenza. This is a bacteria, not a virus. So Haemophilus influenza type B is a bacteria that causes life-threatening illness in kids under the age of 5. So all you have to think about is epiglottitis, We've seen how gross those kids look in the videos I've shown you. For Hib, they need 2 to 3 doses and a booster. Polio does not exist and hasn't existed in the United States since the year 2000 because of vaccinations. The polio vaccine is a killed virus. Every person needs at least 4 doses. And some of the guidance that we should give is any family that's planning on leaving the US with a child that has not completed their series of polio vaccines, a discussion should be had with the provider so that they can be on an accelerated schedule and receive it in less time so that they can be complete with the series before they leave the United States and potentially go to a country where polio has not been eradicated. And some of those countries are like India, certain parts of South America, some of the areas in Indochina, and other Asian countries as well. MMR is a live attenuated vaccine. We can give it on the same day and time as other live attenuated vaccines like varicella. I do want you guys to know that if a parent chooses to spread out the vaccines, which is not suggested and not good practice, they can't get a live vaccine one day and then another live vaccine a week later. So they're just spreading out way too far the length of time it's going to be before their child is fully vaccinated, because you can get 2 live vaccines on one day, but you can't get a live vaccine and then another one in short order. You have to wait 28 days between live vaccines. So either you give them all at once or you got to wait a month in between each one. Anyone who says that they cannot receive a live attenuated vaccine like MMR or varicella because they have an allergy to eggs, that's not the case, because MMR and varicella are not made from the embryonic sac in an egg. It's made from gelatin and or neomycin. So if the person has a reaction, it's not eggs they need to be worried about, it's gelatins and neomycin. Hepatitis A is an inactivated whole virus vaccine. It's spread, Hep A is spread through close physical contact or from eating and drinking contaminated foods and water. Kids are highly susceptible to this because of their poor hygiene, because they are in close contact with other children, and because everything they do goes in their mouth and they're constantly wiping their noses and sharing foods and drinks. Hep B is a recombinant vaccine. Hep B is spread through bodily fluids like mother to newborn at birth. We need our first dose within 12 hours after birth, and we need a total of 4 doses to be considered fully immunized against hepatitis B. Varicella is a live attenuated virus vaccine. So we give it to any child who is between ages like 12 months and 15 months. So I say about 1 to 1.5 years old, they need to have it. And then they receive a second dose between 4 and 6 years. If you encounter a child that is not fully vaccinated, but they've been exposed to someone who has varicella, they can and should be advised to go in and get almost like a booster or a prophylactic dose, and that can be given anywhere from 3 to 5 days post-exposure. Some doctors will give it even after 5 days just to be able to kind of prevent really severe disease. Pneumococcal. So Streptococcal pneumoniae is the most common cause of pneumonia, sepsis, meningitis, and ear infections in kids. So if you know a kid that has a lot of ear infections, ask their parents if they are fully vaccinated and if they received their pneumococcal vaccine. The vaccine is a conjugate, and it has 13 different strains of pneumococcal Streptococcus pneumoniae in it. So there's multiple different strains. If it's a child that has functional or anatomical asplenia, if they have sickle cell, if they have various cardiac, pulmonary, or renal disorders that are chronic and lifelong, if they have diabetes or HIV, or they're otherwise immunocompromised or immunosuppressed, those kids should receive what we call PPSV, which is, it's got 23 strains in it as opposed to the 13. Everybody's heard of influenza vaccines, and we should give that to every kid who's older than 6 months. There's 3 different types of influenza vaccines. There's an inactivated, a recombinant, and a live attenuated type. So frequently, parents will choose the live attenuated type of flu vaccine because it's intranasal. The problem is we can never give the intranasal, because it's a live attenuated vaccine, to anyone who's immunocompromised, immunosuppressed, or they come into physical contact with someone who is immunocompromised or immunosuppressed. We don't give it to asthmatics. We shouldn't give it to any child taking aspirin. The reason for that being that when we hold a little one, let's say we're holding our 3-year-old, I don't know, niece, and the person who's holding them is severely immunocompromised or severely immunosuppressed, that child is leaking that live attenuated vaccine through their skin for anywhere from a couple days to a few weeks. And that contact is going to cause the immunocompromised or severely immunosuppressed person to actually develop the flu because they're having contact with a live vaccine. The same thing happens with kids who come into contact with or are held by family members in countries that use vaccines for tuberculosis, like Mexico or South America. Frequently, many of you who have to get chest x-rays because you pop positive for TB on your skin test. The reason that you pop positive for your skin test is because at some point you were held by an adult who had received a live TB vaccine and they leached it through their skin and into yours. So you don't have TB, but you developed antibodies against it. The only reason you didn't get TB is because you maybe were healthy. So immunocompromise, immunosuppression, we don't give them intranasal flu vaccines. We also don't give it, like I said, to asthmatics or those taking aspirin. But what's nice is that if a kid does have an egg allergy, and influenza is one of the few that's actually made with embryonic cells from the egg, that kid can use an intranasal form despite their egg allergy because they don't make it that way. HPV. If your child is under 15 years old, they need to have 2 shots anywhere from 2 months to 1 year apart. If they're over 15, they need to have 3 shots. Meningococcal, this should be given to every child who is unvaccinated against meningococcal disease at age 11 and 12 years, and then a booster at 16. I'm not going to test you on all of this.